Hi there. Dr. Rob Citino here, the Executive Director of the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, Louisiana. I'm also the Senior Historian at the museum, and I've been asked to speak to you today on an extremely important event, needless to say, in the history of World War II and the 75th anniversary of that event. I'm speaking of Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, the day that Germans signed on the dotted line, gave up their plans for world domination, and agreed to surrender. It seems so simple, right? One day you're fighting, you've won, your enemy gives in, you sign a piece of paper, and peace is reestablished all over the region. Unfortunately, VE Day was nowhere near that simple. And that's the first point I always try to make when speaking about it to students or to public groups who invite me to give a talk on World War II. Europe's a big place. And it's not like someone, I don't know, sounds a horn or waves a flag and suddenly German troops from one corner of Europe to the other surrender, lay down their arms. That's Monday, and on Tuesday, peace has been reestablished all over the region. It's simply more complex than that. It's a much more complex process. And let me give you some examples. There'd already been a series of partial surrenders. On April 29th, German troops in northern Italy signed an act of surrender, and that went into effect first day of May. There was a second partial surrender of German troops in the Netherlands and northwestern Europe. There had been a third of German troops in southern Germany. So some Germans had already, thrown in the towel and laid down their weapons. What's going on here? What the Germans were trying to do is sign a series of partial surrenders with the West, with the Americans and the British. Most German soldiers knew they'd get a better deal if you surrendered to the British or Americans than you would if you surrendered to the Red Army and the Soviet Union. You'd get 3 square meals a day and hopefully humane treatment, where, as you felt, surrendering to the Soviets might be a very, very different story. This isn't Hitler's idea. He's gone. He's shot himself during the Battle of Berlin. But there's a new Fuhrer in town, and that Fuhrer's name is Admiral Karl Dönitz, the head of the German Navy, an important figure in the history of the war, U-boat tactics, wolf pack tactics. But he's not acting as an admiral here. He's acting as the new Fuhrer. I say there's a new Fuhrer in town, and it's not Berlin. Berlin's occupied by the Soviet Union. He's in the small northern German city of Flensburg, and that's where the government, what's left of the Third Reich, is now congregated. He feels that the longer he plays out this process, German troops in the West surrendering, German troops in the East staying in the field, that more German civilians from those eastern territories will be able, as refugees, to escape to the West and perhaps find more humane and better treatment. Dönitz was one of those who, at the Fuhrer's side, insisted that the war go on to the bitter end, and in many ways he's responsible for this catastrophe that's happening. But at any rate, that's the line that he's using at the moment. He's protecting German civilians, and it sounds logical enough to most of his hearers. So, partial surrenders in the West and then war to the utmost in the East. Now, think about who might be upset by that. And if you guessed the Soviet Union, you'd be right. The Soviet Union had done most of the land fighting, suffered most of the casualties during that horrible, bitter campaign in the East. And right now it looks like the Nazis are negotiating with the British and Americans and leaving the Soviets out of the loop altogether. And they're not happy. And they say they're not happy. And they go to Eisenhower and other leaders in the West and say, what are you doing? And eventually Eisenhower gives in. He summons German leaders to the occupied French town of Reims, R-E-I-M-S. And there on May 7th, the Germans sign an act of surrender. There's British officials and French officials and American officials, and there's also a representative of the Soviet Union who all take the signature on the dotted line. The lead German is Hitler's operations chief of staff, General Alfred Jodl. J-O-D-L. And so Jodl signs the surrender, and it looks like the war's over. That's May 7th, goes into effect May 8th, VE Day on May 8th. But then the Soviets, which happens a few times in World War II, throw a kind of monkey wrench into this whole situation. They say, wait, That wasn't official. Yeah, we had a representative there, but we didn't really draw up any of the terms. And anyway, we don't want to surrender signed in occupied France. The surrender should be signed in Berlin. And they insist on a ceremony in Berlin. They summon General Wilhelm Keitel to the scene. He was General Jodel's superior. So in other words, the Soviets are kind of trying to trump the surrender that had taken place in the West by an even more official one in the East. That's May 8th. And so there's all talks, there's papers produced, there have to be changes made to the document. By the time it's signed, it doesn't go into effect till May 9th, and that's when most people hear about it. It's backdated to May 8th, all very complicated. But this is why during the Cold War, the Western world celebrated VE Day on May 8th, and the Soviet bloc celebrated VE Day on May 9th. So it wasn't simply a one-time event. It was a process. If you go to the surrender in northern Italy, April 29th to May 9th, you have 11 days. It's almost 2 weeks that it took the Germans finally to officially surrender, lay down their arms on all fronts. You know, that's the first point I would make. VE Day is a lot more complicated than most people give it credit for. There's a second point, and it has to do with psychology. Sure, it's a happy moment if you're an Allied soldier, let us say, in Europe, British or American, or other allies, Canadians and such, who fought alongside us. It's a happy moment. And I bet you, if you had a bottle of cognac you squirreled away from some French restaurant or monastery on your march across Europe, you probably broke it out and passed it around to the squad or platoon. That's we can imagine. And there were parades in London, big parade in London, big parade in New York. But we also have to keep this in mind. VE Day did not end World War II, not if you were an Allied soldier. There was still an enemy in the field, a big one, an island nation in the Pacific. And soldiers like to say, what am I doing today? You tell them, and they're okay, those are my orders for today. They also give a lot of thought to, I wonder where I'm going to be tomorrow. And virtually every Allied soldier, in his heart of hearts, sailors, airmen, and the like, but every Allied military man knew where they were going. They were going to the Pacific to invade Japan, and a lot of them were going to be killed. That's what they all thought. My father fought in World War II. He was back stateside at the time. He'd been on Guadalcanal. He thought for sure he was going back to the Pacific for the big invasion of Japan. Now, that's not what happened. We all know. We invented a terrible new weapon. The Soviets came into the war against Japan. There didn't have to be a gigantic invasion of the Japanese home islands. But that would be the second point I'd make about VE Day. There's an undercurrent of tension and sadness. President Roosevelt had just died. He hadn't died even a month ago. The flags were still flying at half-staff, a sign of grief. And not only the loss of that great father figure for the American people, but the notion that there was still some World War II to be fought. I think that was in back of mind for every single member of the Allied Armed Forces. So think of the complexity, but also think of the kind of undercurrent of sadness that there was tension to what was on the surface a very, very happy event. So that's my take on VE Day 75. Dr. Rob Citino here from New Orleans saying, once we've all opened back up, please come down and see us at the National World War II Museum. Thanks very much.